kingdom of Israel had never fallen so far so fast. Within a single generation, the nation that had known the glory of Solomon's temple and the wisdom of his reign had descended into spiritual chaos, abandoning the God who had delivered them from Egypt and embracing the fertility cults of their pagan neighbours with an enthusiasm that would have made their ancestors weep. The altars to Yahweh lay neglected and crumbling. The high places dedicated to Baal multiplied across the hillsides like a plague, and on the throne in Samaria sat a king whose very name would become synonymous with apostasy. Ahab, son of Omri, ruler of the northern tribes, and the most wicked monarch Israel had yet produced. Ahab's sins were many, but one eclipsed the others in its devastating impact on the spiritual life of the nation. He had married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians. The union was political in origin, an alliance between Israel and the wealthy Phoenician city-states that controlled the Mediterranean coast, but its consequences were spiritual and catastrophic. Jezebel was not content merely to worship her native gods in private. She was a missionary for Baal, determined to establish his cult as the official religion of her adopted kingdom. She imported hundreds of prophets dedicated to Baal and Asherah, installed them in positions of honour at the royal court, and launched a systematic campaign to silence or destroy anyone who remained loyal to the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. Baal was the storm god, the lord of rain and fertility, the deity whom the Canaanites credited with making the crops grow and the livestock multiply. His worship involved rituals that would have horrified earlier generations of Israelites: sacred prostitution, self-mutilation, and in some cases the sacrifice of children. But the allure of Baal was powerful precisely because he seemed to offer what farmers and herdsmen needed most: control over the unpredictable forces of nature that determined whether families would eat or starve. In a land where drought was a constant threat and rain a precious gift, the promise of a God who could guarantee fertility was almost irresistible. Into this spiritual wasteland stepped a man whose very name was a declaration of war against everything Ahab and Jezebel represented. Elijah, in Hebrew, Eliyahu, meaning my God is Yahweh, appeared without genealogy, without credentials, without the backing of any institution or the support of any powerful patron. He came from Tishbe, a village in the rugged wilderness of Gilead, east of the Jordan River, and he carried no weapon except the word of the Lord burning in his bones. He was rough where the court prophets were polished, fierce where they were accommodating, uncompromising where they had learned to bend with every shift in the political winds. The confrontation began without preamble, without negotiation, without any of the diplomatic niceties that typically governed interactions between prophets and kings. Elijah simply appeared before Ahab. How he gained access to the royal presence the text does not say, and delivered a message that struck at the very heart of Baal's supposed authority. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word. The declaration was audacious beyond measure. Elijah was not merely predicting a drought. He was announcing a direct challenge to the God whom Ahab and Jezebel had championed, a theological duel between Yahweh and Baal fought on Baal's own territory. If Baal truly controlled the rain, let him prove it. If he was truly the Lord of fertility, let him demonstrate his power against the word of a prophet from the Gilead wilderness. The sky would remain sealed, the clouds would withhold their moisture, and the land would wither, not because of natural cycles or random misfortune, but because the God of Israel had spoken through his servant and creation itself would obey. The heavens responded immediately. From the moment Elijah spoke those words, the rain ceased. The spring rains that farmers depended on failed to materialize. The autumn rains that replenished the cisterns and prepared the ground for planting never came. Day after day, week after week, month after month, the sky remained an unbroken expanse of burning blue, and the land beneath it began to die. But God was not finished with his instructions. Having sent Elijah to deliver the message of judgment, he now sent him into hiding, not out of fear, but out of purpose. The prophet who had announced the drought would need to survive it, and survival required withdrawal from the public eye, from the rage of Jezebel, from the desperate searching of a king who would soon want answers that Elijah was not yet prepared to give. "Get away from here and turn eastward," the Lord commanded, "and hide by the brook Cherith, which flows into the Jordan, and it will be that you shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there." The brook Cherith was a small stream cutting through the wilderness east of the Jordan, a place of solitude and silence far removed from the centres of power, where Elijah's message would be reverberating through the halls of government. It was not an obvious refuge, not a fortified city, not a sympathetic household, not even a cave with natural defences. It was simply a trickle of water in a dry land, a ribbon of life that would sustain the prophet while the rest of the nation withered. Elijah went. The text offers no record of hesitation or objection, no bargaining about the terms of his exile, no questions about how long he would need to stay or what would happen next. He simply obeyed, walking eastward through a landscape that was already beginning to feel the grip of the drought he had announced, leaving behind whatever life he'd known in Tishbe, and embracing a solitude that would test him in ways he could not have anticipated. The days at the brook Cherith settled into a rhythm unlike anything Elijah had experienced before. Each morning he woke to the sound of water moving over stones, a gentle, persistent music that reminded him of the provision that sustained him. Each evening, as the shadows lengthened and the heat of the day began to dissipate, ravens appeared with food in their beaks, bread and meat delivered by creatures that Jewish law considered unclean, commanded by a God who could use anything and anyone to accomplish his purposes. It was a strange existence, this life of waiting and being fed by birds, but it was also a profound education in dependence. Elijah could do nothing to earn his sustenance. He could only receive it day by day, trusting that the God who had sent him here would continue to provide. The loneliness must have been intense. Prophets were not, by nature, hermits. They were proclaimers, messengers, men whose calling demanded interaction with the communities to which they were sent. Elijah had delivered a word that would reshape the destiny of a nation, and now he sat beside a stream watching the days pass with no one to talk to except the God who had placed him there. The silence gave him time to think, to pray, to process the enormity of what he had set in motion. It also gave him time to wonder about the people suffering under the drought, about the king and queen who even now might be hunting for him, about the future that remained hidden behind the veil of divine purpose. Meanwhile, the drought was tightening its grip on the land. The fields that should have been green with spring barley turned brown and brittle under the relentless sun. The cisterns that families depended on for water during the dry summer months began to drop, their levels falling week by week as no rain came to replenish them. Livestock grew thin and weak, then began to die in numbers that threatened the economic foundation of the kingdom. The streams that fed the Jordan shrank to trickles, and the wells that had served villages for generations began to fail. The suffering was not limited to Israel. Drought respects no political boundaries, and the same atmospheric conditions that were punishing Ahab's kingdom spread outward into the surrounding nations. The Phoenician coast felt the impact, and the inland regions of Syria and the territories to the south and east that depended on the same weather patterns. Families who had done nothing to provoke the God of Israel found themselves caught up in a judgment they did not understand, victims of a cosmic struggle between Yahweh and Baal that was being fought over their heads. In the palace at Samaria, Ahab watched his kingdom wither and raged against the prophet who had pronounced this curse upon him. Jezebel, whose faith in Baal remained unshaken despite the mounting evidence of his impotence, intensified her persecution of Yahweh's remaining prophets, as if silencing the messengers could somehow reverse the message they had delivered. The 450 prophets of Baal cried out to their God for rain, performing the rituals that were supposed to unlock the heavens and received only silence in return. The theological contest that Elijah had initiated was being decided in the fields and the cisterns, in the dying crops and the empty wells, and Baal was losing. But Elijah saw none of this from his hiding place by the brook. He knew only what God revealed to him, and God revealed little during those months of waiting. The prophet who had stood before the most powerful king in Israel with a word of judgment now sat alone in the wilderness, dependent on ravens for his food and a shrinking stream for his water. The contrast was stark, the humiliation real. This was not how prophets were supposed to live. This was not the triumphant aftermath of a dramatic confrontation with evil. This was obscurity, powerlessness, the slow erosion of certainty as the brook that sustained him began to fail. Because the brook did fail. The waters that had sustained Elijah through the early months of the drought began to recede, the flow diminishing day by day as the sources that fed it dried up in the relentless heat. Elijah watched the water level drop, watched the stones that had been submerged emerge one by one from the retreating stream, watched his provision disappear while he waited for a word from the God who had placed him here. The ravens still came with their bread and meat, but water could not be delivered on wings. Without the brook, he would die. The test was severe, but it was also purposeful. God was teaching his prophet something essential about the nature of faith and provision, that the sources of sustenance are always temporary, always subject to circumstances beyond our control, always dependent on the one who stands behind them. The brook had never been Elijah's true provider. God had been his provider, using the brook as an instrument. And when that instrument failed, the provider remained, ready to direct his servant to a new source of sustenance in a place Elijah would never have chosen on his own. The word of the Lord came to him again, breaking the silence of his waiting with instructions that must have seemed as strange as the original command to hide by the brook. "Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. See, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you." Zarephath. The name would have sent a chill down the spine of any faithful Israelite. It was a Phoenician city located on the Mediterranean coast between Tyre and Sidon, the very heartland of Baal worship, the territory from which Jezebel had come, the last place on earth where a prophet of Yahweh might expect to find refuge. God was sending Elijah not to safety but deeper into danger, not to the comfort of his own people, but to the alien territory of his enemies. And the provision waiting for him there was not a wealthy patron or a hidden community of faithful Israelites, but a widow, a woman at the bottom of the social hierarchy, someone with no husband to protect her, and, as Elijah would soon discover, no resources to sustain herself. The brook had dried up. The God who had placed him there was now calling him forward into unknown territory, toward a destination that made no human sense, to depend on a provider who seemed incapable of providing anything. When the brook dries, faith is required to take the next step. And sometimes that step leads into places we never expected, toward people we never imagined, into provision we could never have predicted. The journey from the brook Cherith to Zarephath was not a short one. Elijah would need to travel northwest from his hiding place in the wilderness of Gilead, crossing the Jordan River, making his way through the territories of Israel that were suffering under the drought he had pronounced, and eventually passing beyond the borders of the covenant people into the Phoenician lands along the Mediterranean coast. The distance was perhaps 85 miles as the crow flies, but the actual path, winding through valleys and over hills, avoiding population centres where he might be recognised, navigating terrain that the drought had transformed into a wasteland, would have been considerably longer. It was a journey measured not in hours but in days, a slow pilgrimage through a dying land toward a destination that promised nothing but uncertainty. He set out with nothing except the clothes on his back and the word of God burning in his heart. The ravens would not follow him on this journey. There would be no miraculous provision along the road, no streams appearing in the wilderness to quench his thirst. He would have to walk through the consequences of his own prophecy, experiencing firsthand what the people of Israel were experiencing, feeling in his own body the weight of the judgment he had announced. It was one thing to proclaim a drought from the safety of a hidden brook. It was another thing entirely to walk through it, day after day, with parched lips and an empty stomach. The landscape told the story of what the drought had accomplished. Fields that should have been thick with grain stood barren, the stalks withered and brown, the soil cracked into patterns that resembled the scales of some great dying serpent. Orchards that had provided fruit for generations now displayed only skeletal branches, their leaves long since fallen, their roots reaching desperately into earth that held no moisture. The streams that Elijah crossed were either dry beds of stones and sand, or muddy trickles that barely deserved the name of water. Even the air seemed different, hotter, drier, carrying the dust of a land that was slowly turning to desert. He passed through villages where the people moved with the particular slowness of the starving, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow with a despair that had moved beyond hope into mere endurance. Children who should have been playing in the streets sat listlessly in doorways, their bellies swollen with the particular distension that accompanies severe malnutrition. Women walked miles to draw water from wells that were failing, carrying jars that grew heavier with each passing week as the water table dropped and the depths required to reach it increased. Men sat in the shade of dying trees, their livestock sold or slaughtered, their fields abandoned, their futures reduced to the simple question of whether they would survive until the rains returned. Elijah saw all of this, and the seeing must have been its own kind of suffering. He was not a cruel man, not someone who took pleasure in the pain of others. He had pronounced the drought because God had commanded him to pronounce it, because the spiritual sickness of Israel required a dramatic intervention, because Baal's pretensions to power over the rain needed to be exposed as the lies they were. But the theological necessity of the drought did not make its human cost any easier to witness. These were his people, descendants of Abraham like himself, and they were dying because their king had led them into apostasy, and because God had chosen Elijah to be the instrument of their correction. The border between Israel and Phoenicia was not marked by walls or guard posts. It was simply a transition from one territory to another, from land that belonged to the covenant people to land that had never known the God of Abraham. Crossing it, Elijah entered a different world. The Phoenicians were seafarers and traders, their cities oriented toward the Mediterranean rather than the inland territories, their wealth built on commerce rather than agriculture. But even here, the drought had taken its toll. Ships might bring grain from Egypt or other lands that had escaped the famine, but such imports could not feed everyone, and the prices they commanded put them beyond the reach of ordinary people. The poor of Phoenicia were suffering alongside the poor of Israel, caught up in a catastrophe they had done nothing to cause. Zarephath lay along the coastal road between Tyre and Sidon, a small town that had existed for centuries, its fortunes rising and falling with the trade that passed through the region. It was not an important place, not a centre of power or wealth, not a destination that anyone would seek out for its own sake, but it was the place God had chosen, and Elijah walked toward it with the same obedience that had carried him to the brook Cherith months earlier. He did not know what awaited him there. He knew only that God had commanded a widow to provide for him, and that somehow, in this unlikely place, provision would be found. He reached the gate of the city as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western sea. The gate was the social centre of any ancient town, the place where business was conducted, disputes were settled, news was exchanged, and travellers were assessed by the local population. Elijah would have attracted attention simply by his appearance. The rough clothing of a man who had lived in the wilderness, the weathered face of someone who had walked through days of sun and wind, the bearing of a prophet even if no one present could have identified him as such. But what he saw at the gate drove all thoughts of his own appearance from his mind. A woman was gathering sticks. She moved among the scrub brush near the entrance to the town, bending slowly to pick up twigs and small branches, her movements marked by the weakness of someone who had not eaten properly in a long time. Her clothing was worn and patched, the garments of poverty rather than prosperity, and her frame was thin in a way that spoke of meals missed and portions reduced. She was a widow. Elijah knew this somehow, perhaps through divine revelation, perhaps through the simple observation that no husband was helping her with this menial task, perhaps through an instinct honed by years of reading the circumstances of those he encountered. She was gathering fuel for a fire, and something in her posture suggested that this fire would be different from the ones that had come before. Elijah approached her, and the words he spoke must have seemed inexplicable given his obvious condition as a traveller who had been walking for days through a famine-stricken land. "Please bring me a little water in a cup that I may drink." The request was simple enough. Travellers often asked locals for water, and hospitality customs in the ancient Near East obligated people to provide such basic assistance when they could. The woman turned to comply, perhaps grateful for a task that distracted her from whatever grim thoughts had been occupying her mind. But before she could take more than a few steps, Elijah called out again, "Please bring me a morsel of bread in your hand." It was this second request that stopped her. Water she might have been able to provide, even in a drought some sources remained, and the Mediterranean coast had access to resources that inland areas lacked. But bread, food. She turned back to face this stranger. and the words that came from her lips carried the weight of utter desperation. "As the Lord your God lives, I do not have bread, only a handful of flour in a bin and a little oil in a jar. And look, I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." The statement was not dramatic exaggeration. It was the simple truth of her situation, spoken with the particular flatness of someone who has moved beyond grief into acceptance. She had a handful of flour, perhaps enough for one small loaf, one final meal. She had a little oil, just enough to bind the flour and make it edible. She was gathering sticks to make a fire, and when that fire burned down and the bread was consumed, there would be nothing left. She and her son would eat their last meal together, and then they would wait for death to claim them, because there was no other option available. The reference to the Lord your God revealed that she recognized Elijah as an Israelite, someone who worshipped the deity her own people had abandoned or never known. She was not a follower of Yahweh herself. She was a Phoenician, raised in the shadow of Baal worship, living in territory that Jezebel had come from before her marriage to Ahab. And yet here she was, swearing by Israel's God, using his name in her oath of truthfulness, perhaps sensing something in this stranger that commanded a different kind of response than she would have given to an ordinary traveller. Elijah's reply to her hopeless declaration was not what anyone would have expected. He did not apologize for his request. He did not withdraw it in light of her circumstances. He did not offer sympathy or suggest that she should save what little she had for herself and her son. Instead, he made a demand that must have seemed like madness, followed by a promise that must have seemed like fantasy. "Do not fear. Go and do as you have said, but make me a small cake from it first and bring it to me, and afterward make some for yourself and your son." The audacity of the request was staggering. A stranger was asking a starving widow to give him her last handful of flour, to feed him before feeding herself and her dying child, to trust that somehow this sequence of giving would not result in the death that she had already accepted as inevitable. It was an inversion of every survival instinct, every maternal impulse, every rational calculation about how to allocate scarce resources in a crisis. He was asking her to die first, in effect, to give away the only thing standing between her family and starvation, on the word of a man she had never met. But Elijah was not finished. The demand was accompanied by a promise, and the promise came not from Elijah himself, but from the God he served. "For thus says the Lord God of Israel, the bin of flour shall not be used up, nor shall the jar of oil run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain on the earth." The promise was specific and measurable. The flour would not be consumed, the oil would not be depleted. Day after day, for as long as the drought continued, the meagre supplies in her household would prove inexhaustible, not through massive abundance, but through daily renewal, enough for each day's need and no more. The God of Israel, speaking through his prophet, was offering this Phoenician widow a covenant of provision that would sustain her through the very famine that was killing her neighbours. The woman stood at the crossroads of faith and despair, the stranger's words hanging in the air between them. Everything she knew about how the world worked said that his promise was impossible. Flour does not multiply. Oil does not replenish itself. The laws of nature do not bend to accommodate the needs of starving widows, however desperate their circumstances. She had lived long enough to know that miracles did not happen to people like her, in places like this, during times like these. And yet, something in the prophet's voice, something in his eyes, something in the inexplicable confidence with which he made this outrageous promise, something reached past her despair and touched a place within her that had not yet given up entirely. Perhaps it was the specific invocation of the Lord God of Israel, a deity she did not worship but whose power she could not dismiss. Perhaps it was the fact that this stranger was willing to stake his own survival on the truth of what he was saying. If the flour ran out, he would starve alongside her. Perhaps it was simply the desperation of someone with nothing left to lose, willing to try anything, even something as absurd as trusting a foreign prophet's promise of supernatural provision. She made her choice. She went and did according to the word of Elijah. A starving woman gathering sticks for her final meal took a leap of faith that would sustain her household through years of famine. And in that leap she stepped into a story far larger than her own survival. A story that would involve death and resurrection, despair and deliverance, and the demonstration of Yahweh's power in the very heartland of Baal's territory. The first morning after Elijah's arrival, the widow woke before dawn with the particular dread of someone expecting to confirm a disaster. She had done as the prophet asked, had given him her last handful of flour, had watched him eat the small cake she had prepared, had then made what remained for herself and her son. They had gone to sleep with food in their bellies for the first time in days, but the arithmetic of their situation had not changed. The flour was gone, the oil was consumed. Today would bring the reckoning that yesterday's strange encounter had only postponed. She rose quietly, not wanting to wake her son, and made her way to the corner of the small house, where the bin of flour and the jar of oil were stored. The containers were simple clay vessels, the kind that every household possessed, unremarkable in every way except for what they represented, the last barrier between her family and starvation. She reached for the flour bin first, her fingers trembling slightly as she lifted the lid, her eyes adjusting to the dim light of early morning. The bin was not empty. She stared at the flour within, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. She had scraped this vessel clean the day before, had used every grain to make the cakes that the prophet had requested. There had been nothing left. She was certain of this, as certain as she was of her own name. And yet here was flour, a handful at least, perhaps more than she had started with the previous morning. She reached in and let the fine powder run through her fingers, feeling its reality, its weight, its impossible presence in a container that should have been empty. The oil jar told the same story. When she tilted it toward the light, she could see the golden liquid pooling at the bottom. Not much, never much, but enough. Enough for another day, enough to make another meal, enough to keep death at bay for 24 more hours. The widow sank to her knees beside the vessels, her body shaking with an emotion she could not name. It was not quite joy. The circumstances were too desperate for simple happiness. It was not quite relief. The future remained uncertain, the drought still pressing down on the land, the provision still limited to what appeared each morning in these two containers. It was something closer to awe, the response of a human soul confronted with evidence that the world contained more than she had believed, that powers existed beyond her understanding, that the God of the stranger sleeping in her upper room was real and had chosen, for reasons she could not fathom, to extend his hand to her. She made breakfast that morning with the reverence of a priestess performing a sacred ritual. The flour was measured carefully, the oil poured with deliberate attention, the fire built and tended with a focus that transformed mundane cooking into an act of worship. When her son woke and stumbled into the main room, rubbing sleep from his eyes, she placed food before him without explanation. When the prophet descended from the upper room where he had spent the night, she served him as well, watching his face for any sign of surprise at the meal's existence. But Elijah ate as if he had expected nothing less, as if the multiplication of flour and oil was simply how things worked when God had spoken a promise. And so the days began to accumulate, each one a repetition of the same quiet miracle. The widow would wake, check the containers, find them supplied with exactly enough for the day's needs. She would prepare food for the three of them, herself, her son, and the prophet who had become an unexpected member of their household. They would eat together, pray together, wait together for the drought to break and the world to return to normal. The flour never ran out. The oil never failed. Day after day, week after week, month after month, the promise held. The rhythm of life in that small house settled into something almost peaceful. Elijah, who had spent months in the solitude of the brook Cherith, now found himself part of a family, an unusual family to be sure, comprising a Phoenician widow and her young son, but a family nonetheless. He occupied the upper room, a small chamber accessed by exterior stairs, and he spent his days in prayer and waiting, listening for the voice of God that had guided him thus far and would guide him still. But he also descended to share meals with his hosts, to observe the ordinary rhythms of their domestic life, to become a presence that was no longer strange but simply part of the household's reality. For the widow, the prophet's presence was both comfort and mystery. She had taken him in on faith, had trusted his word when trusting seemed like madness, and that trust had been rewarded with daily provision that defied every natural law she understood. But who was he really? What was he doing here, in Zarephath, so far from his own people and his own land? What larger purpose was being worked out through his presence in her home? And what would happen when that purpose was fulfilled? These questions surfaced in quiet moments, when the day's work was done and the evening stretched out before them, but she rarely voiced them aloud. Some mysteries were better left unexamined, at least for now. The boy thrived in ways that his mother had not dared to hope for. When Elijah had first arrived, the child had been weak from malnutrition, his growth stunted by months of inadequate food, his energy depleted by a body that had been consuming itself to survive. But with regular meals, modest by any normal standard, but infinitely more than famine conditions allowed, he began to recover. Colour returned to his cheeks, strength returned to his limbs. The listlessness that had marked his movements gave way to the natural vitality of childhood, the running and climbing and playing that healthy children take for granted. His mother watched this transformation with gratitude that approached reverence, seeing in her son's recovery daily evidence of the God who was sustaining them. Outside the walls of their home, the world continued to wither. The drought that Elijah had pronounced showed no signs of relenting, and the suffering it caused only intensified as the months stretched into what would eventually become years. Neighbours who had once been prosperous found their resources exhausted, their livestock dead, their futures reduced to the desperate calculations of survival. Some left Zarephath entirely, seeking relief in other regions or throwing themselves on the mercy of distant relatives. Others stayed and starved, their bodies growing weaker, their hope growing dimmer, their faith in Baal, or in any god, eroding with each rainless day. The widow was aware of this suffering, could not avoid being aware of it in a town as small as Zarephath. She saw the hollow faces in the marketplace, heard the whispered conversations about families that had run out of food, watched the funeral processions that grew more frequent as the drought claimed its victims one by one. The contrast between her household's provision and her neighbour's deprivation was stark, almost uncomfortable. Why had she been chosen for this miracle? Why were her flour and oil multiplied while others went hungry? What made her worthy of divine intervention when so many others, perhaps more devout, perhaps more deserving by any human measure, received nothing? She did not know the answers to these questions, and Elijah did not provide them. The prophet was not given to lengthy theological explanations. He spoke when God gave him words to speak, and he remained silent when no words were given. But his presence itself was a kind of answer, a reminder that the God of Israel operated by his own logic, chose whom he chose, blessed whom he blessed, for reasons that did not always align with human expectations of fairness or merit. The widow had not earned this provision. She had simply believed when belief was offered to her, and her belief had been honoured with sustenance that would continue until the drought ended. The days lengthened into seasons and the household found its rhythm. Elijah prayed and waited and listened. The widow managed the home, stretching the daily provision into meals that satisfied without indulging, learning to live within the narrow margins of miraculous sufficiency. The boy grew and played and gradually forgot what it had been like to be hungry, the trauma of the famine years fading into the background of childhood memory. They were an unlikely family, a Hebrew prophet, a Phoenician widow, a child who belonged to neither world, but they had become a unit, bound together by the strange providence that had brought them under the same roof. The miracle of the flour and oil was not dramatic in the way that the parting of seas or the falling of fire would be dramatic. It was quiet, daily, almost domestic. A provision that appeared each morning without fanfare, sustained 3 lives without attracting attention, demonstrated God's faithfulness in the most ordinary of ways. No crowds gathered to witness it. No songs were composed to celebrate it. It was simply there, day after day, a constant in a world that had become terrifyingly inconstant, a whisper of divine care in the midst of divine judgment. But the peace of that household was fragile. sustained by grace but not immune to the storms that could arise even in places of provision. The God who had multiplied flour and oil had not promised that suffering would never touch them. He had promised sustenance through the drought, nothing more, nothing less. And the drought was not the only form of darkness that could descend upon a home where faith was being tested and refined. The widow did not know it yet, but the greatest test was still ahead. The miracle that had sustained them was about to be eclipsed by a tragedy that would shake her faith to its foundations, and the prophet who had brought provision to her household would be called upon to bring something far more costly, far more impossible, far more revelatory of the God he served. A fragile peace had settled over the home, but storms can rise even in places of provision, and the storm that was coming would bring death itself to the widow's door. The illness came without warning, as illness so often does, an unwelcome intruder that slipped past the defences of provision and faith to strike at the heart of everything the widow held dear. One evening her son was playing in the courtyard, chasing shadows, in the fading light, his laughter rising into the air like an offering of joy. The next morning he did not want to rise from his sleeping mat, complaining of a headache and a strange heaviness in his limbs. By midday, the fever had begun. The widow did what mothers have always done when their children fall sick. She bathed his forehead with cool water drawn from the household's meagre supply. She prepared broth from the flour and oil that still appeared each morning, trying to coax nourishment into a body that had begun to refuse food. She sat beside him through the long hours of the afternoon, holding his hand, singing the song she'd sung over his cradle, praying to whatever gods might be listening that this fever would break, that this sickness would pass, that her son, her only son, the sole remaining treasure of her widowed existence, would be restored to health. But the fever did not break. It climbed instead, burning through the boy's small body with a ferocity that seemed almost personal, almost malicious. His skin grew hot to the touch, then hotter still, until pressing a hand to his forehead was like pressing it against sun-baked stone. His eyes, which had sparkled with recovered vitality just days before, grew dull and unfocused, staring at things his mother could not see. His breathing, which should have been the steady rhythm of sleeping childhood, became laboured and shallow, each breath a struggle, each exhalation a small surrender. The widow had known fear before. She had feared starvation during the early months of the drought, had feared death when she gathered those final sticks outside the city gate, had feared the unknown when a foreign prophet asked her to give away her last handful of flour. But this fear was different. This fear had claws that sank into her chest and would not release their grip. This fear whispered that the God who had multiplied flour and oil might not be willing or able to heal a dying child. This fear suggested that the provision she had enjoyed was temporary, conditional, part of some cosmic transaction whose terms she had never fully understood. Elijah watched from the doorway, his weathered face drawn with concern. He had seen death before, had pronounced judgment on a nation that would claim countless lives, had walked through villages where the drought's victims lay unburied because there was no one left with strength to dig graves. But this was different. This was a child he had come to know, a boy who had brought him cups of water and asked him questions about the God of Israel and laughed at the raven's clumsiness when Elijah told stories of his time at the brook Cherith. This was a life intertwined with his own, a household he had been sent to sustain, a family that had become precious to him in ways he had not anticipated. The prophet prayed, but his prayers seemed to rise no higher than the ceiling of the small house. He sought the voice of God that had guided him so clearly in the past, the voice that had sent him to Cherith, then to Zarephath, that had promised the flour and oil would not fail. But the voice was silent. Heaven offered no word of comfort, no promise of healing, no instruction for what to do as the boy's condition deteriorated hour by hour. Elijah was left to watch and wait and wrestle with the same questions that were tormenting the widow. Why was this happening? What did it mean? Had they done something wrong or failed to do something right? That would explain why death was reaching for the child even as miraculous provision continued to appear in the kitchen vessels. 3 days passed, or perhaps 4. The widow would never be able to remember exactly, the hours blurring together into a continuous nightmare of fear and exhaustion, She stopped eating, unable to stomach food while her son lay dying. She stopped sleeping, afraid that if she closed her eyes for even a moment, she would open them to find him gone. She stopped speaking to Elijah, her mind too consumed with grief to form coherent sentences, her emotions too raw to risk exposure to another person's gaze. She simply sat beside her son's mat, holding his hand, watching his chest rise and fall with increasingly shallow breaths, and waiting for the end she could no longer pretend was not coming. The end came on a morning that dawned like any other. Pale light filtering through the window, the sounds of the town beginning to stir outside, the daily miracle of flour and oil waiting untouched in the vessels where it had appeared. The widow was dozing in the chair beside her son's mat, her hand still clasping his, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion she had fought for days. She woke to silence. Not the ordinary silence of early morning, but a deeper silence, a silence that seemed to press against her eardrums, that filled the room with its terrible presence, that communicated without words what she already knew in the depths of her being. Her son's hand was cool in her grip, his chest was still. The laboured breathing that had been the soundtrack of her nightmare had ceased, and in its place was nothing, absolutely nothing. She did not scream. She did not weep. Not yet. She simply sat frozen, staring at the face of her child, trying to comprehend a reality that her mind refused to accept. He had been playing in the courtyard just days ago. He had been growing stronger, recovering from the famine that had nearly claimed them both. The miracle had been working. God had been providing. Everything had been getting better, had been moving toward a life rather than death, had been evidence that she had made the right choice when she trusted the prophet's impossible promise. And now her son was dead. The grief, when it finally came, was not a wave but an avalanche, a crushing weight that buried her beneath its enormity, that pressed the air from her lungs and the hope from her heart. She gathered her son's body into her arms and held him, against her chest, rocking back and forth, keening a wordless lament that rose from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. The sound filled the small house, escaped through the windows, drifted into the streets where neighbours paused and shook their heads, with the particular sympathy reserved for mothers who have lost children. Zarephath had seen much death in these drought years, but each death was still a death, each loss still a loss, each mother's grief still worthy of acknowledgement. Elijah descended from the upper room at the sound of her keening, his face ashen, his movements hesitant. He had failed. The thought hammered at his consciousness with each step down the stairs. He had been sent to this household to sustain it, and he had sustained it, with flour and oil that never ran out, with the daily provision of a faithful God. But the provision had not been enough. The sustenance had not prevented this tragedy. The miracle had continued right up to the moment of the boy's death, and had somehow been powerless to stop it. The widow looked up as he entered the room, and the expression on her face was not grief alone. It was something harder, sharper, an accusation forged in the furnace of unbearable loss, a question that demanded an answer she knew he could not give. "What have I to do with you, O man of God? Have you come to me to bring my sin to remembrance, and to kill my son?" The words struck Elijah like stones. She was not blaming him for failing to save the boy. She was blaming him for the boy's death itself. In her anguish, she had reached for an explanation that made sense of the senseless, and the explanation she found was theological. The prophet's presence had reminded God of her sins, had drawn divine attention to her unworthiness, had brought judgment where provision had briefly seemed to promise grace. She'd been hiding in a sense, hiding from divine notice, surviving below the radar of whatever cosmic accounting system determined who lived and who died. And then Elijah had come, and God had come with him. And now her sins were remembered and her son was dead. It was not a rational accusation, but grief rarely is. It was the cry of a mother who needed someone to blame, something to make sense of her suffering, some narrative that would explain why the worst thing imaginable had happened to her despite, or perhaps because of, the miracles she had witnessed. The God who could multiply flour could surely heal a child. The God who had promised provision through the drought had surely promised more than this, unless her sins had cancelled the promise, unless she was not worthy of the miracle after all, unless the whole thing had been a cruel setup for this final devastating reversal. Elijah did not defend himself. He did not argue theology or explain the mysteries of providence, or remind her of the daily miracles that had sustained her household for months. He simply looked at the boy's lifeless body, still cradled in his mother's arms, and felt something rise within him that was beyond words, a resolve, a desperation, a determination to bring this matter before the God who had sent him here and demand an answer. "Give me your son." The words were quiet but commanding, spoken with an authority that cut through the widow's grief and compelled her compliance. She did not ask what he intended to do. She did not resist or hesitate. She simply surrendered the small body into his arms, watching with empty eyes as the prophet turned and carried her son toward the stairs that led to the upper room. Elijah climbed those stairs with the weight of death in his arms. Literal weight. The physical burden of a child who would never run or laugh or ask questions again. And spiritual weight. The crushing awareness that everything he had believed about his mission was being tested in this moment. He had been sent to sustain this household. The household had been sustained. And yet here was death, undeniable and undefeated, mocking the miracle of flour and oil with its presence in the very home that divine provision had preserved. The upper room was small and spare, containing only the bed where Elijah slept and a few simple furnishings. He laid the boy on his own bed, arranging the small limbs with gentle care, smoothing the hair back from the pale forehead. Then he stood over the body and lifted his eyes toward heaven, and the words that came from his mouth were not a polished prayer but a raw cry torn from the depths of his being. He was about to wrestle with God in a way he had never wrestled before, and the outcome of that wrestling would determine whether death had the final word in the widow's house, or whether the God of Israel had power even over the grave. The miracle that had sustained the household seemed to vanish as death entered the home. But Elijah was not finished, and neither was God. The upper room had become a sanctuary of grief, a small space suspended between earth and heaven, where a prophet stood alone with death and dared to demand its reversal. The boy lay motionless on Elijah's bed, his small form barely creating a ripple in the rough blankets, his face already taking on the waxy pallor that marked the departure of life. The silence in the room was absolute. No breath, no heartbeat, no stirring of the spirit that had animated this child just days before. Only stillness and the weight of mortality pressing down on everything like a physical force. Elijah stood over the body, and for a long moment he did not pray. He simply looked, at the closed eyes that had once sparkled with curiosity, at the lips that had asked him countless questions about his God and his homeland, at the hands that had brought him cups of water and tugged at his robe when stories were wanted. This was not an abstraction, not a theological problem to be solved, not a test case for the power of Yahweh. This was a child, this was a son, this was a life that had been entrusted to his care by a God who had sent him to this household for purposes that suddenly seemed cruelly incomplete. The prayer, when it finally came, was not the measured petition of a seasoned intercessor. It was a cry, raw, anguished, torn from the depths of a man who had reached the end of his understanding and found only questions where answers should have been. O Lord my God, have you also brought tragedy on the widow with whom I lodge, by killing her son? The words were not diplomatic. They were not carefully chosen to avoid offence, or to acknowledge divine sovereignty with appropriate humility. They were an accusation, or something close to it, a demand for explanation from a prophet who had obeyed every instruction, followed every leading, trusted every promise, and now stood in a room where death had made a mockery of all that obedience and trust. Have you done this? The question hung in the air, unanswered, pressing against the silence that filled the space between Elijah and the God he served. There was no immediate response, no voice from heaven, no angelic visitation, no sign that the Almighty had even heard the prophet's cry. The room remained silent, the boy remained still, and Elijah remained standing with his grief and his anger and his desperate need for something, anything, that would make sense of what had happened. But Elijah was not a man accustomed to accepting silence as the final word. He had stood before Ahab and pronounced drought over the entire land. He had walked through the wilderness sustained by ravens. He had promised a starving widow that her flour and oil would not fail, and that promise had been kept for months without interruption. The God he served was not absent or impotent. He was sovereign over nature and nations, over life and death, over every circumstance that human beings faced. If death had entered this house, it was not because God lacked the power to prevent it. And if God had the power to prevent it, perhaps he also had the power to reverse it. The thought took root in Elijah's mind and refused to be dislodged. Reverse it. The idea was audacious, unprecedented, without any clear precedent in the history of Israel. The patriarchs had not raised the dead. Moses had not raised the dead. Joshua and the judges and Samuel and all the prophets who had come before, none of them had called a soul back from beyond the grave. Death was final, the one boundary that even the greatest servants of God had never crossed. To ask for its reversal was to ask for something that had never been done, to venture into territory where no prophet had ever walked. But Elijah asked anyway. He stretched himself out upon the child, a strange, intimate gesture that placed his living body in contact with the dead one, his warmth against the boy's cooling flesh, his breath against the face that had stopped breathing. The posture was not prescribed by any ritual or tradition. It seemed to arise from pure instinct, from a desperate need to bridge the gap between life and death through physical presence. Elijah was not merely praying from a distance. He was entering into the boy's death as fully as he could while still alive, identifying with him, covering him, refusing to let the separation of death be the final reality. O Lord my God, I pray, let this child's soul return to him. The prayer was simpler this time, stripped of accusation, focused entirely on the request. Let his soul return. The Hebrew conception of death understood it as the departure of the nephesh, the life breath or soul that animated the body and made it a living being. When the nephesh departed, death resulted. If it could somehow be recalled, life would resume. Elijah was asking God to reverse the process, to command the boy's soul to return to the body it had vacated, to restore what death had taken. Nothing happened. The boy remained motionless, the room remained silent, and Elijah remained stretched over the small form, his own breathing the only sound in the stillness. The prophet's faith was being tested in a crucible, hotter than anything he had experienced at the brook Cherith, or in the confrontation with Ahab. It would have been easier in some ways to accept the silence as God's answer, to rise from the bed, descend the stairs, and tell the widow that her son was beyond even divine intervention. That was how the world worked, after all. Death won. Death always won. To believe otherwise was to set oneself up for disappointment, to extend hope where hope had no business being extended. But Elijah did not rise. He stretched himself out a second time, pressing his body against the boy's, covering the small form with his own larger one, breathing his own breath against the face that had grown cold. The repetition was not magical incantation. It was persistence, the refusal to accept no as the final answer, the determination to keep asking until heaven responded or hope itself expired. O Lord my God, I pray, let this child's soul return to him. Still nothing. The silence stretched on, broken only by Elijah's increasingly ragged breathing, by the small sounds of a man wrestling with forces beyond his control. Downstairs, the widow waited in her grief, probably expecting the prophet to return with confirmation of what she already knew, that her son was dead, that the God who had provided flour and oil had not provided healing, that the miracle had run out at the moment she needed it most. The weight of her expectation pressed on Elijah alongside the weight of his own doubt, his own uncertainty, his own growing fear that he had ventured beyond the boundaries of what even God was willing to do. A third time. Elijah stretched himself upon the child a third time, and this time his prayer carried a note of desperation that bordered on demand. He was not asking politely anymore. He was not hedging his request with appropriate theological qualifications. He was pressing in, insisting, exercising the peculiar authority that comes to those who have walked with God long enough to know that persistence is sometimes required, that the kingdom of heaven sometimes suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. O Lord my God, I pray, let this child's soul return to him. 3 times he had prayed. 3 times he had stretched himself over the body. 3 times he had asked for the impossible, believing against all evidence that the God who had called him, who had sent him to this place, who had sustained him through drought and famine, would not abandon him now. The number 3 carried weight in Hebrew thought. Completion, fullness, the totality of effort extended without reservation. Elijah had held nothing back. He had given everything he had to this prayer, every ounce of faith, every shred of hope, every bit of spiritual authority that his prophetic office conferred. And now he waited. The tension in that room was the tension between heaven and earth, between divine sovereignty and human pleading, between the finality of death and the possibility of life. The God of Israel was not obligated to answer. He had not promised to raise the dead, had not established any precedent that would require him to act in this case, had not given Elijah any assurance that this particular prayer would be granted. The prophet lay stretched over the boy's body with no guarantee except the character of the God he served, the God who had heard Israel's groaning in Egypt, who had answered Hannah's desperate prayer for a son, who had responded to the cries of his people throughout their history when those cries came from hearts that truly sought him. The room was still. The boy was still. Heaven itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. In the silence, Elijah became aware of something changing, not in himself, not in the room, but in the small body beneath him. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible, easily dismissed as imagination or wishful thinking. A warmth that had not been there before, spreading slowly through the limbs that had grown cold. A movement in the chest, slight but unmistakable, as lungs that had been empty began to fill with air. A flutter beneath closed eyelids, as consciousness returned to a brain that had been dark. The boy's soul had returned. Elijah lifted himself slowly, afraid to move too quickly, afraid that what he was witnessing might somehow be reversed if he startled it. The colour was returning to the child's face, not the flush of fever this time, but the healthy pink of circulating blood, of oxygen reaching tissues that had been deprived of it. The chest was rising and falling now, regular and strong, the breath of life restored to a body that had been claimed by death. And then, as Elijah watched with tears streaming down his weathered face, the boy's eyes opened. They focused slowly, those eyes, adjusting to the light, taking in the surroundings, registering the face of the prophet who had prayed him back from wherever death had taken him. There was no fear in them, no confusion, no trauma from the journey he had made. They were simply the eyes of a child waking from sleep, curious about the world, wondering perhaps why the prophet was crying. Elijah gathered the boy in his arms, holding him close, feeling the warmth of life against his chest where the cold of death had been just moments before. The prayer had been answered. The impossible had happened. Death had been reversed, not through any power of Elijah's own, but through the sovereign response of a God who heard desperate prayers and sometimes chose to answer them in ways that shattered every expectation of what was possible. The weight that had pressed on the prophet's soul since he first carried the lifeless body up these stairs was gone now, replaced by a lightness that was almost dizzying. He had wrestled with God and prevailed, not through his own strength, but through the strange grace that allowed human persistence to move the divine heart. The boy was alive. The widow's son was restored. The household that had been sustained by miraculous flour and oil had now been sustained by something even more miraculous, the return of life where death had seemed absolute. Elijah rose from the bed, still cradling the child, and turned toward the door. Downstairs, a mother was waiting, a mother who expected only confirmation of her worst fears, who had accused him of bringing death to her household, who had surrendered her son's body with the empty eyes of one who had nothing left to hope for. He was about to give her something she had never dared to imagine. A prophet had wrestled with God in the silence of an upper room, pleading for life where death had come. And against all odds, against all precedent, against everything the world knew about the finality of the grave, life had won. The stairs leading down from the upper room had never seemed so long nor so significant. Elijah descended them slowly, the boy cradled against his chest, each step carrying him closer to a mother who had no idea what was coming. The child had not spoken yet, was perhaps still too dazed from his journey back from wherever death had taken him, but his arms had found their way around the prophet's neck, and his head rested against Elijah's shoulder, with the trusting weight of a son being carried by his father. The warmth of that small body, the rhythm of that restored breathing, the miracle of that beating heart, these were realities now, tangible and undeniable, and Elijah carried them downstairs like the most precious cargo in the world. The widow sat where he had left her, crumpled on the floor near the place where her son had died. She had not moved in the time he had been upstairs. Grief had pinned her in place, heavy as a stone, robbing her of the energy to do anything except exist in her pain. Her eyes were closed, her lips moving in what might have been prayer, or might have been the mindless repetition of words that had lost all meaning. She did not hear Elijah's footsteps on the stairs. She did not sense his approach. She was lost in a darkness so complete that light itself seemed like a distant memory. "See, your son lives." The words fell into her grief like a stone dropped into still water. For a moment they did not penetrate. They were sounds without meaning, syllables that her mind refused to process because processing them would require believing something impossible. Her eyes remained closed. Her body remained still. She had heard wrong, surely. Or Elijah was speaking metaphorically, offering some spiritual comfort about her son living on in memory or in the presence of God. The dead did not return. Everyone knew this. The dead did not return. But then she heard it. A sound that pierced through her stupor more effectively than any words could have done. A small voice, hoarse from disuse, tentative with confusion, but unmistakable in its identity. "Mother?" Her eyes flew open. The scene before her defied comprehension. Elijah standing in the doorway, her son in his arms, her son who had been dead, her son whose body she had surrendered to the prophet just. How long ago? It could have been hours or days. Time had lost all meaning in the fog of her grief, but there he was, alive, his eyes open and blinking in the light, his chest rising and falling with breath, his lips forming the word that she had thought she would never hear again. She did not remember rising to her feet. She did not remember crossing the room. She was simply there, suddenly her arms wrapped around her child, pulling him from Elijah's embrace into her own, clutching him against her chest as if he might be snatched away again if she loosened her grip for even a moment. The sounds that came from her throat were not words. They were something more primal, a mixture of sobs and laughter and cries that seemed to emerge from somewhere deeper than her voice box, from the very core of her being where the grief had lodged, and now found itself transformed into something entirely different. The boy, bewildered by the intensity of his mother's response, patted her back with his small hand, the instinctive gesture of a child trying to comfort a parent whose emotions have become overwhelming. "Mother, why are you crying?" he asked, and the innocence of the question only intensified her weeping. He did not know. He could not know what had happened, what she had witnessed, what had been lost and was now restored. He knew only that his mother was holding him tighter than she had ever held him before, and that the prophet was watching from the doorway with tears of his own streaming down his weathered face. Minutes passed, perhaps many minutes, before the widow could compose herself enough to speak. When she finally lifted her face from her son's hair and looked at Elijah, her expression had been transformed. The accusation that had marked her features when she blamed him for her son's death was gone entirely, replaced by something that combined awe, gratitude, and a dawning understanding that she was standing in the presence of something holy. The man before her was not merely a wandering prophet seeking shelter from a drought. He was a vessel of divine power, a channel through which the God of Israel had reached into her home and accomplished what she would never have believed possible. "Now by this I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is the truth." The declaration was more than personal testimony. It was theological confession. She had hosted Elijah for months, had witnessed the daily miracle of flour and oil that never ran out, had provided for his needs, and received his presence as an inexplicable gift in the midst of famine. But even those wonders had not produced the certainty that now filled her voice. Multiplying flour was remarkable. Returning life to the dead was something else entirely. The God who could reverse death was not merely one deity among many, not simply a more powerful version of Baal or the other gods her people worshipped. He was the Lord of life itself, the sovereign over the boundary that no other power could cross, and the man who spoke his word was validated beyond any possibility of doubt. The word of the Lord in your mouth is the truth. The statement reached beyond the immediate miracle to encompass everything Elijah had spoken since his arrival in Zarephath. The promise that the flour would not be used up and the oil would not run dry, that had been truth. The implicit assurance of his presence that God would provide for this household, that had been truth. And now, whatever words Elijah would speak in the future, whatever pronouncements he would make in the name of the God of Israel, they could be trusted absolutely. A man who could pray the dead back to life was a man whose words carried the authority of heaven itself. For Elijah, the widow's declaration was confirmation of something he had needed to know. The months of hiding, first at Cherith, then here in Zarephath, had been a time of preparation, but also a time of uncertainty. He had pronounced drought over Israel, and then disappeared into the wilderness, cut off from news of how his prophecy was unfolding, isolated from the confrontation that he knew must eventually come. The ravens had fed him, the widow had housed him, but what was it all for? What purpose was being served by this extended sojourn in foreign territory, while his own people suffered under the judgment he had announced? Now he understood, at least in part. The God who would send him back to Israel, who would call him to confront Ahab and the prophets of Baal, who would demonstrate his power in fire from heaven on Mount Carmel, that God had first demonstrated his power in this quiet upper room, in this foreign widow's house, in the resurrection of a child that no one except the immediate family would ever witness. Elijah's faith had been tested and strengthened. His prayers had been proven effective beyond anything he had imagined possible. He had discovered resources within his relationship with God that he had not known existed, reserves of spiritual authority that could call life out of death itself. Whatever awaited him in Israel, he would face it knowing what he now knew, that the God he served was sovereign over everything, including the grave. The household that had been sustained by miracle was now transformed by something greater than sustenance. The flour and oil continued to appear each morning, as they had from the beginning, but the atmosphere in the home was different now. The widow moved through her days with a lightness that had nothing to do with physical circumstances and everything to do with the certainty that had taken root in her soul. Her son played in the courtyard with the abandon of healthy childhood, apparently untraumatized by his brush with death, perhaps not even fully aware of how close he'd come to never playing again. And Elijah prayed in his upper room with a confidence that had been forged in the crucible of desperation, an answered prayer. The neighbours noticed the change, as neighbours always do. The widow who had kept to herself, who had drawn water at odd hours and avoided the marketplace when possible, now moved through Zarephath with her head held high. She did not proclaim what had happened. Some miracles are too sacred for casual conversation, but she did not hide either. When asked about the prophet who lived in her home, she spoke of him with a reverence that raised eyebrows and invited questions. When pressed about her source of food in a famine that was destroying families all around her, she simply smiled and said that the God of Israel was providing. Let them make of that what they would. The boy, for his part, became something of a wonder in the small community. Children who had been wasting away from malnutrition watched him run and climb and play with undisguised envy. His mother's refusal to explain their household's prosperity only added to the mystery that surrounded them. Some whispered that she'd made a pact with dark forces. Others suggested that she had found a hidden store of grain that she was keeping for herself. But a few, a perceptive few, wondered if something else was happening in that modest house, something that had to do with the foreign prophet and the God he served. The emotional restoration of the household was complete in ways that went beyond the boy's physical recovery. The widow's faith, which had been shattered by her son's death, was now rebuilt on a foundation stronger than anything she had known before. Her anger at Elijah, her accusation that he had brought divine judgment on her household, had been replaced by an understanding that God's purposes were deeper and more complex than she had imagined. The tragedy had been real, but it had also been temporary. a darkness that had given way to a dawn more glorious than any she had expected. She would never fully understand why her son had to die in order to be raised, but she no longer needed to understand. She had seen enough to trust, and trust was sufficient. For Elijah, the weeks following the resurrection were a time of quiet reflection and renewed preparation. He sensed that his sojourn in Zarephath was drawing to a close, that the God who had hidden him here was preparing to send him back into the arena of confrontation, where his prophetic calling would be tested on a much larger stage. The drought continued, 3 years now since he had pronounced it before Ahab, 3 years of suffering and death across Israel and the surrounding nations, and the resolution of that drought would require a demonstration of Yahweh's power that the whole nation would witness. Mount Carmel was waiting. The prophets of Baal were waiting. The showdown that would determine whether Israel would serve Yahweh or Baal was waiting. But Elijah was ready now in a way he had not been ready before. He had learned to wait on God at the brook Cherith. He had learned to trust God's unconventional provision in the household of a Phoenician widow. And he had learned, in the upper room where a dead child lay on his bed, that the God he served held power over life and death itself. Whatever fire he would call down from heaven, whatever miracles he would perform before the assembled prophets of Baal, whatever victory he would win for Yahweh on the heights of Carmel, none of it would surpass what had already happened in this quiet house in Zarephath. Life had been restored, faith had been strengthened, a calling had been affirmed, and the stage was being set for the greatest confrontation in Israel's prophetic history. The miracle of the upper room would remain a private matter, known only to a widow, her son, and the prophet who had prayed a child back from the dead. But its effects would ripple outward in ways none of them could foresee, preparing Elijah for battles yet to come, and establishing once and for all that the God of Israel was no regional deity limited to the borders of the covenant land. He was Lord of Phoenicia as well as Judah, sovereign over Zarephath as well as Jerusalem, and his power reached beyond the grave into realms that Baal and all his prophets could never touch. The home that had known death was now filled with awe, and the prophet who had entered it as a refugee would leave it as a warrior, prepared for the greatest mission of his life. The story of what happened in Zarephath would outlive everyone who witnessed it. Centuries later, when Jesus of Nazareth stood in the synagogue of his hometown and read from the scroll of Isaiah, he would reach for this account to make a point that would nearly cost him his life. Many widows were in Israel in the days of Elijah, he declared, when the heaven was shut up 3 years and 6 months, and there was a great famine throughout all the land. But to none of them was Elijah sent except to Zarephath, in the region of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow. The congregation that heard these words understood their implication immediately. God's grace was not confined to Israel, not limited to the covenant people, not restricted by the boundaries that human religion sought to enforce. A foreign widow in pagan territory had received what Israelite widows had been denied, and the scandal of that divine choice still had power to provoke outrage more than 800 years after it occurred. But why? Why had God chosen to send his prophet to Zarephath of all places? Why had he sustained Elijah through a Phoenician widow, rather than through faithful Israelites who would have been honoured to provide for him? Why had the first resurrection recorded in Scripture taken place not in Jerusalem or Samaria, not in the heartland of the covenant people, but in the very territory from which Jezebel had come to corrupt Israel with her Baal worship? The questions resist easy answers, but they point toward truths that the story embodies without fully explaining. Grace operates beyond borders. This is perhaps the most fundamental lesson of the Zarephath narrative. The God who had chosen Israel as his special possession was not thereby limited to Israel in his operations. He remained sovereign over all nations, all peoples, all territories, including territories that had never acknowledged him and populations that had worshipped other gods for generations. The widow of Zarephath had done nothing to earn divine favour. She had not converted to the worship of Yahweh, had not made pilgrimage to Jerusalem, had not offered sacrifices at any legitimate altar. She had simply been chosen, for reasons known only to the God who chose her, to receive provision that her neighbours did not receive, and miracles that the faithful in Israel could only dream about. This pattern would repeat throughout the biblical narrative, Gentiles receiving grace that Israel rejected, outsiders welcomed while insiders remained distant, the last becoming first, and the first becoming last. The widow of Zarephath was an early instance of a recurring theme, a preview of the gospel that would eventually break down the wall of partition between Jew and Gentile and declare that whoever called on the name of the Lord would be saved. Her story was a crack in the edifice of religious exclusivism, a reminder that God's mercy could not be contained by human categories of worthiness and belonging. Provision comes in unexpected places. The widow had been gathering sticks for her final meal when Elijah found her. She had exhausted every resource, depleted every reserve, reached the absolute end of her ability to survive. And it was precisely there, at the point of total depletion, that provision arrived, not before she had used up her flour and oil. Then, God might have seemed merely helpful, not when she still had options and alternatives. Then, she might have credited her own resourcefulness. But at the moment when death seemed certain, when hope had been abandoned, when the only remaining question was how long the end would take, at that moment provision appeared in the form of a foreign prophet with an impossible promise. The pattern speaks to anyone who has ever reached the end of their resources. God's provision often arrives at the last possible moment, not because he is cruel or indifferent to suffering, but because he is teaching a deeper lesson about the source of sustenance. The widow needed to know that her survival came from Yahweh, not from her own efforts or fortunate circumstances. The daily miracle of flour and oil drove that lesson home with relentless repetition. Every morning, provision appeared that she had not earned and could not explain. Every morning she was reminded that her life depended on a power beyond herself, a faithfulness that did not fluctuate with her performance or her worthiness. Faith arises from the unlikely. The widow was not a promising candidate for belief. She was a pagan, a Gentile, a worshipper of gods that the God of Israel had declared to be no gods at all. She had no theological training, no heritage of faith, no community of believers to support and encourage her. And yet, when confronted with the choice between trusting the prophet's word and surrendering to death, she chose trust. Her faith was not sophisticated. It was desperate, a last-ditch gamble when all other options had been foreclosed. But it was real, and God honoured it with provision that lasted for years and a miracle that death itself could not prevent. The story suggests that faith is less about background and more about response. The widow responded to the word she was given. She did not demand additional evidence or negotiate better terms or wait until she felt more confident. She simply did what the prophet said, trusting that his God would keep the promise his words conveyed. This kind of faith, simple, active, responsive, proved sufficient to unlock the storehouses of heaven and eventually to bring her son back from the dead. Those with more impressive credentials and deeper theological knowledge often fail to exercise such faith. This foreign widow, with nothing to recommend her except her need, became a model of what trusting God actually looks like. For Elijah, the time in Zarephath accomplished something essential in his preparation for what lay ahead. The prophet who would stand alone on Mount Carmel against 450 prophets of Baal, who would call down fire from heaven and execute the false prophets by the brook Kishon, who would outrun Ahab's chariot in the power of the Spirit, that prophet needed to know certain things about the God he served before he could face such a confrontation. He needed to know that God could provide in the wilderness, using ravens to bring food to a hiding prophet. He needed to know that God's power extended beyond the borders of Israel, operating with equal authority in Phoenician territory. And he needed to know that God held power over death itself, that the grave was not beyond his reach, that life could return to a body from which it had departed. All of these lessons were taught in the classroom of Zarephath, far from the public eye, without fanfare or audience. Elijah learned them in the quiet of a widow's home, in the daily discipline of waiting for provision that always came, in the desperate prayer of an upper room where a child lay dead. By the time God sent him back to Israel to confront Ahab, he was not the same prophet who had pronounced the drought and fled to Cherith. He had been refined, deepened, strengthened in ways that only extended solitude and answered prayer can strengthen. The fire that would fall on Carmel had already fallen, in a sense, in the upper room of Zarephath when God answered Elijah's cry and restored the widow's son. The widow herself was transformed by her experiences in ways that would mark the rest of her life. She had entered the story as a woman preparing to die, bereft of hope, resigned to the extinction of her family line. She emerged from it as a woman who had witnessed the power of the living God demonstrated in her own household, first in provision that never failed, then in resurrection that reversed the ultimate loss. Her confession to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is the truth," was not merely polite acknowledgement. It was the declaration of a soul that had been fundamentally reoriented, turned from the worship of gods who could not save to the recognition of a God who had proven himself sovereign over bread and death alike. What became of her after Elijah departed? The scriptures do not say. She disappears from the narrative as quietly as she entered it, returning to the obscurity from which divine providence had briefly lifted her. But she carried with her a story that she would surely tell for the rest of her days. The story of a prophet who appeared at the city gate, of flour that never ran out and oil that never failed, of a son who died and lived again. Her neighbours in Zarephath may or may not have believed her account. The people of Phoenicia were not, as a whole, converted by her testimony. But she knew what she knew, and that knowledge was sufficient to sustain her through whatever remained of her earthly journey. The spiritual meaning of this narrative reaches across the centuries to address anyone who has ever felt forgotten by God, marginalized by religious systems, or convinced that miracles happen to other people in other places but never here, never now, never to someone like me. The widow of Zarephath was all of these things, forgotten, marginalized, convinced of her own exclusion from divine blessing, and yet God came to her anyway, sent his prophet to her door, multiplied her meagre resources, and raised her son from death. If grace could find her in Phoenicia during a famine sent as judgment on Israel, grace can find anyone, anywhere, under any circumstances. God meets people in scarcity. He does not wait until our lives are in order, until our faith is mature, until our resources are adequate. He meets us where we are, with what we have, in the midst of our desperation. The handful of flour and the small amount of oil were not obstacles to his provision. They were the starting point for it. He multiplies what we bring to him, however inadequate it may seem. He hears desperate prayers. Elijah's prayer in the upper room was not eloquent or theologically sophisticated. It was raw, anguished, almost accusatory. But God heard it anyway, responded to it anyway, did the impossible in answer to it anyway. The quality of our prayers matters less than the sincerity of our hearts and the object of our faith. A desperate prayer directed to the true God accomplishes more than a polished prayer directed elsewhere. He brings life where hope seems gone. This is the ultimate message of Zarephath, that death does not have the final word, that the God who created life can restore it, that endings are not always endings when the sovereign Lord is involved. The widow's son was the first person in recorded scripture to be raised from the dead, but he would not be the last. His resurrection pointed forward to a greater resurrection that would occur centuries later outside Jerusalem, when another dead body would be raised and death itself would be defeated forever. The flour that multiplied, the oil that never ran dry, the child who died and lived again. These were not merely ancient miracles confined to a particular time and place. They were windows into the character of a God who still provides, still hears, still brings life from death. The widow's story is an invitation to trust that same God with whatever scarcity we face, whatever prayers we pray, whatever death we fear. In a small house in Zarephath, during a famine that was killing thousands, God demonstrated that no cry is too small to reach heaven. A foreign widow discovered that the God of Israel was her God too, and a prophet learned that the power he carried was sufficient for anything, even the grave. The jar of flour was not used up. The jug of oil did not run dry. And the boy who had stopped breathing woke up in the arms of a prophet who had refused to stop praying. Some miracles echo forever. This is one of them.